an original.
From Story Studio Network.
The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? This is the 2030 Project. It's a podcast that explores why poverty persists and what we can do about it in this country. We endeavor to uncover what's been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy, but then what needs to come next. The 2030 Project tackles some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing this country today. I'm Dave Trafford, and thanks for joining us. It's become apparent that we have grown communities, intentionally or otherwise, in such a way that all of a sudden that access to food is not nearly as readily available as we would have otherwise thought. So I think we really kind of need to get into and maybe break down some of the ideas that you can just go to the store and get what you need and you're good. Not that easy. And in fact, it's not that easy just to go to the food bank. We've created circumstances where we've made it more difficult, quite frankly, particularly for vulnerable communities, to get access to food. So we're going to try and solve this problem in the next 20 minutes. There's no pressure. Dave Hardy is an urban planner. He is the president at Hardy Stevenson and Associates. Ryan Noble is the food bank director at the North York Food Bank. And Jennifer Black is a UBC Associate Professor who's done a good deal of work on what goes on at the Vancouver Food Bank. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And I think, Jennifer, it isn't as apparent to me that there's a problem with access to food. And it's only until I really started to look at this from this perspective of the 2030 Project that, okay, there's a bigger problem here. And I use this phrase a lot. It's hiding in plain view. Is that the situation in Vancouver?
I can just start out telling the story of where I started thinking about this was when I was a young dietitian, actually working in New York City. And my first job was working with low-income folks in largely racialized neighborhoods and trying to give them nutrition advice. And recognizing in some of the neighborhoods where we're living, it was extraordinarily hard to find affordable, fresh foods that were being recommended by dietitians to maintain good health. So, lots of work had started happening trying to document these sorts of things, trying to understand and figure out how to even explain what a neighborhood looked like where food access was challenging to come by. And what we've learned is it's really hard even to describe those factors because it is kind of hidden. There are some neighborhoods where it feels like it's harder to find food, but really the intersecting challenges that make it tough for people to access food is, there's got to be a place to buy it. You have to have enough money to access it if it's there. You have to have transportation. You have to have a way to carry stuff home if you're pushing a stroller or strolling in a wheelchair. So it's really this stuff all merged together in terms of what does it mean to be able to access food.
Well, it's interesting. Just pick up on one thing that Jennifer said, Ryan, and the idea of, we talk about racialized communities. Okay, I lived in Toronto when it was pretty much, a white community. There wasn't really, we didn't talk a lot about racialized communities, and it has grown in terms of immigration. It's become sort of the center of the universe for a diverse population. We celebrate that, but at the same time, my guess is, coincidentally, that you're seeing that we have that the vulnerability of those particular communities is reflected in the people who use your services at the food bank.
Absolutely. What we know in Toronto is when we look at the demographics of the city and we look at the demographics of the population who uses food bank services, that we see some disproportionate communities. And that's specifically people who would identify as Black, people who identify as Indigenous, people who identify as being from Latin America, or people who identify as being from the Middle East are all dramatically, disproportionately overrepresented in the food bank usage population compared to the general population of the city. We know from other research that even when you control for such variables as income, that race is still a predictor of food security. So it is impossible to talk about food security, access to food, without actually speaking about the structural barriers and the structural obstacles that people have, and race is, very high on that list.
Dave Hardy, we recently we attended as we're recording this. We're in the middle of an election campaign here in Ontario, and we were recently at an event in Scarborough, and this came up in no uncertain terms in terms of, poverty actually being a really critical issue specifically to communities in Scarborough because of what Ryan's described. Because we've got racialized communities there. They're new Canadians, many of them, but there aren't the services to support them, and it just becomes a very difficult cycle that they embark on.
Yeah, and Dave, we were shocked to see the figure of 1 in 10 Scarborough residents either on disability or Ontario Works on welfare, one sort of another. And we were trying to unwrap, well, why? And Scarborough tends to be a place where it's a landing zone for people from all over the world who want to come to Canada. The Syrians, the refugees, they came to Scarborough. The Tamils came to Scarborough. We have folks from Chinese and Africa and South Asia all coming. And those first couple of years are very difficult for new immigrants. So it was something that we really need to pay a lot of attention to. And as an urban planner, we have control over or influence, anyways, over what's on the land and what's built and so on. And I've talked to a couple of my colleagues, planners in Scarborough, and we don't like what we see, what the communities that we planted. It has not. It's not something that would make us proud.
So where did it go off the rails there? Because clearly we did not intentionally create community where people were going to be living in poverty, where people were going to have less access to food. Where did it kind of miss the mark? Because you and I've talked often about this. You guys are looking 25, 30 years down the road. We can see demographic trends that are going to develop. We know that there's going to be so many more kids in this community in 40 years perhaps than there was 40 years ago. And I'm throwing that number around, but to make the point that pretty much we could predict where we were going with immigration and so on. Where did it go off the rails? Yeah,
what's a critically important piece of this is that in earlier days, urban planning came out of the health profession, actually. And it's an old profession that came out of the old European cities where there was disease and so on. And with people saying we need a better way to plan our cities and so on. And even more recently, though, years ago, when we did comprehensive plans, we looked at not only the buildings, but who are the people in the buildings, who are the families, and so on. What is the impact of changing land use on the people who live in those communities? We've really gotten away from that very seriously. And I was just blown away by, we're doing a comprehensive municipal plan here in Toronto, and the planners we're talking about, okay, well, we need equity, diversity, and inclusion. Really important in a municipal official plan. Scarborough having 70% visible majority. They said, well, to learn about equity and diversity and inclusion, we're going to go to Minneapolis. And I go, what? You
really?
You can't go to Scarborough and meet people who are racially diverse? Like, there's just a total disconnect between how we plan our communities and our cities and actually what happens on the ground and what good policy is.
All right. So, all of this is long term. In the immediate term, Ryan, it falls back on your plate, figuratively speaking. Surely, and I know from talking to the folks at Daily Bread and Neil Hetherington and his team, what's the short-term, easy solution here? And I don't throw that phrase around lightly. I mean, there must be low-hanging fruit, to Dave's point, where we can say, this is happening here. We've got real lived experience in this particular community that we should draw upon to solve problems faster than doing a study in Minneapolis.
Yeah, and if I could just pick up a little bit on what Dave said, the downstream effect of that lack of planning is something we've seen over, frankly, a generation. So for decades now, we've seen a migration of poverty. You mentioned Scarborough, but it's true sort of across the northern inner suburbs of Toronto and beyond that into the GTA, beyond the actual city. So that's true in North York, that's true in Scarborough, and that is true in a place like Etobicoke, for example. So we've seen this migration of people who need services of poverty out of the core of the city, or the former city of Toronto, into the inner suburbs, largely driven by housing costs. But at the same time, so we see an influx of people who need the services, but we also see a lack of access to those services. So they're in areas where historically, and it's true whether we're talking about food supports, but also employment services, settlement services, transportation, childcare, you name it, just don't exist to the same extent and with the same density in the suburbs as they do in the core. So it really creates this sort of double whammy, if you will, where you see a spike of usage without the accompanying service. And that's what we've been dealing with, as you said, Dave, day to day for some time now. So, low-hanging fruit is a tough one. So I guess there's sort of two pieces that we look at. We look at how do we support the emergency crisis that we're in today. So how can we make the provision of food assistance more efficient, more effective, more accessible, lower barriers, more welcoming spaces, those types of things. While at the same time, it may not be low-hanging fruit from a political perspective, but there are some relatively straightforward answers as to how we would reduce the number of people coming to food banks. And Dave mentioned it, the 1 in 10 people living on ODSP and disability support, or about 2/3 of the client base in Toronto rely on one of two income support programs, welfare programs, if you will, Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support, as their primary source of income. Those were plans that were put in place in at least the current rates were kind of set in the 1990s and really haven't been significantly increased since then, and aren't indexed to inflation. So we see an increase in housing costs. We see inflation in all of the expenses that somebody has in their household budget. But the primary source of income, and the other third is roughly, is going to be on minimum wage or minimum wage jobs. So when you put all that together, you see this isn't a large, complicated sort of philosophical problem. It's one of arithmetic. There just simply is not enough revenue coming into somebody's household budget, not enough income to match the skyrocketing expenses. And the gap in that is often food, because it is much easier, and you shouldn't do it, and Jennifer will know as a dietitian, you shouldn't skip meals. You shouldn't go without food as a parent so that your child is able to eat. But those are the decisions that people are needing to make, because you can't skip a rent payment, or you can't not pay your utility bill. So it's the sort of last flexible piece in a household budget. So that's sort of where food insecurity, in many cases, every case is unique, but in broad strokes, that's sort of what's driving it, at least here in Toronto. So there are some easy fixes. I wouldn't necessarily call them low-hanging fruit because of the politics associated with them make them difficult, but they're relatively straightforward fixes. So I think those are the long-term is looking at things like income, whether that's, as I said, income from employment in terms of minimum wage levels, or income from social assistance in terms of specifically those two programs, Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support, and also looking at affordable housing solutions. Those, I think, together are the ultimate answers to food insecurity and the associated poverty, or the poverty that's associated with that.
Was framing it as saying, low-hanging fruit is one thing, but I think that, Jennifer, when we look at there are solutions there, and if we look at it from the perspective of here in this province, costs Ontario $33 billion a year to service the cost of poverty every year. So how can we not afford to get rid of it? And to kind of get at the nut of it in terms of access to food, and as Ryan describes it, this becomes an economic conversation very quickly. And you will know, as well as we are here in Toronto, housing prices are just out of this world. So that in and of itself creates a problem when we get back to Dave Hardy's discussion around land usage and everything else. All of a sudden, it's not just a political discussion. It's a really hard dollars and cents economic decision that really is hard to back away from when you're looking at the kinds of, money that you could make selling that property in Vancouver or here in Toronto.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just trying to tie together a bunch of the themes that were already raised. I agree with Ryan. I think fundamentally we need to start with people having enough money to access food regardless of the geography. For a start, for some low-hanging fruit, I think it's great to have urban planners and food systems people and poverty people coming together, because I think having this food lens at the city level, asking, where is the food as we plan cities, and making sure transportation routes and all the amenities are available to make sure people can access it is key. And then just, thinking about the other question of which cities and models should we use to start thinking about planning the big cities in Canada. It's interesting to look at the way we talk about some of these issues on different sides of the border. I came from working and studying in the US, where we were using this language around food deserts, thinking that there were these places that were thought of as predominantly low income, where supermarkets were hard to find. And there were these systematic patterns where inner cities were underserviced by large grocery stores. And I came back to Canada thinking, well, it's going to turn out exactly like that in Vancouver and Toronto and Canadian cities. And it just turns out it's really different here. We did some research in the municipal areas around BC, thinking, we'd also find low-income urban areas resourced less by food stores. And it turned out to be the complete opposite, because if you think about cities like Vancouver, wealthy neighborhoods where large single detached houses are not the places where small or large grocery stores are zoned. They're zoned on busy streets and dense urban neighborhoods, on transportation corridors. So it's just sort of shaking up our ideas about where we assume poor access to food is. Here it can be, the low income seniors living in basement apartments and fancy neighborhoods that have the toughest time getting to stores. I think we need to make sure people have the basic amenities they need to access food. We need to make sure neighborhoods are built thoughtfully and purposefully so that people with diverse mobility needs and family structures can access the foods they need and are in places where, their neighborhoods have the cultural foods that they're looking for at prices that they can afford.
Well, Dave Hardy, when we get into that discussion then, and we're back into your bailiwick in terms of planning, is there a way to retrofit, for want of a better phrase, that community that Jennifer has described, to say, these are the three things that we would have to go do a rebuild with some urgency to avoid that problem?
Yeah, before we get to retrofitting, and Jennifer and Ryan are raising really good points, I just want to stop the creation of new food deserts. We have a big intensification, movement and for new housing in Toronto. And the developers have bought up all the plazas, basically, which means they bought up plazas with food stores. And I talked to a lot of residents. I think I'm the only planner in Toronto who actually talks to residents. But they said, Dave, they're tearing down our food store and they're building condos, and there's no food store to replace it. Or they're tearing down the local school because the demographics have shifted and there's not as much kids for the schools. But those schools provided school food programs, and there's going to be townhomes on those schools, and there's no replacement food programs for these children. And, to me, it's as fundamental as getting maps of food deserts and putting under the noses of planners. We see, unfortunately, that's a bad statement about planning, but we see people who are like us. We don't see people who are aged or disabled, who are vulnerable or ill. They're all like us, and they fit into buildings that we plan, and we make them look pretty. And we have real great piazzas for people to walk. but we don't look at who's inside and who the people are that we're planning for. So before retrofitting, I think we need to stop the bleeding here in a sense and shake people up and say, look, there's real problems here that we need to stop. And then in terms of retrofitting, I think we need to move forward. I was really struck during COVID where it was a stress test for a lot of planning. And we saw not only the food banks were full, but also the churches were just overwhelmed. So we had a church change its function to become a local community food bank. Okay, so that tells us what the need is in the community. We need to pay attention to that, and we just haven't got there yet.
On the issue, too, of retrofitting, I mean, COVID has, and Dave raised a really good point. I mean, COVID showed where the fragility in our system and where the lack of resilience is from a food perspective. I like to tell just a short little anecdote. If we go back to March of 2020, right when the pandemic first sort of hit, we were looking at our map. North York Harvest is a network of food banks. So we were looking at our map of across the northern half of the city, and throughout that day, food banks are often located in places like schools or places of worship or community centers. And throughout that day, one by one, all those places closed and all shut down. So we were faced, and I remember saying to my partner that evening, I think we're out of business. We had food in our warehouse. We had trucks ready to go. We had no place to this point of access, no places where people in the community could actually come safely and actually access food. So that was a real crisis, a real difficult time for us. But, and this is, I guess, to Dave, to your other question around how do we retrofit, what we did see, and this is our challenge is to keep this going, is all of a sudden sort of the previous rules were, and I don't mean rules in a hard sense, but kind of our thinking went out the window, and we were able to sort of pivot and recreate really quickly. So we opened pop-up programs in libraries that had been shut down, in community centers, and sometimes we use parking lots. We built one of our largest food banks right now, started in a Zamboni room at an arena at Bathurst and Finch. You never think that's where we put a food bank. We're now building it into a permanent food center. And so what we found through that, and that built on some work we had done pre-COVID as well, of locating food banks and food programs in multi-service agencies, and working with, particularly at the municipal level, our government partners to say, you have a lot of space. You have a lot of real estate. Because the other side of it is this issue of real estate and affordability that impact at an individual level, at a community level, also impact the organizations like North York Harvest and our ability to actually have safe places for people to come and get food. We need to have real estate for our warehouse, for our offices, and for our food programs. So all of a sudden we could see this partnership existing and coming together with places like the Toronto Public Library System, which had all sorts of spaces that were safe and welcoming and on transit routes, where we could build food programs that not only gave us a space for the food program, but now also started to connect us to other types of services that those, whether it's a health center, whether it's a settlement service, whether it's income support, all the types of things people need beyond that emergency of food today to start to build a more sustainable livelihood. So to me, I think, I mentioned some of the political solutions that are our long-term solutions. But here and now, one thing we could do, is really leverage that model, working with, again, particularly at the municipal level, but at all levels of government, to leverage that public space for community and nonprofit type of programming.
Yeah, I guess, Jennifer, at the risk of cheering for COVID, it was a valuable lesson learned. Here's the problem I have with it, though, is that, folks like Ryan and those who were on the ground having to come up with a solution were very innovative, thoughtful, outside the box. They weren't using the phrase, we've always done it this way. That doesn't fit anymore. The only problem is that he's now made the food bank that much more efficient so that it's baked into the economy even more. I mean, I realize this is a greater need, but the whole point is that he does want to go out of business, right? I mean, that's the whole issue here. Now, I don't know if we can plan our way out of this or not, but if we look at lessons learned, and I'd be curious to get your perspective, because British Columbia's experience with COVID was markedly different than it was here in Ontario and certainly in Toronto. If there was something in BC, and particularly in Vancouver, where you can pinpoint and say, as Brian did, I know we didn't intend this, but we've become more efficient as a result of the COVID experience.
I really wasn't on the ground as Ryan has been. I have been with the data and with the students and largely working at home. I know some of our largest food banks consolidated in ways that were really concerning. They moved from having lots of pickup sites to just a few sites. Some of our largest food banks decided to implement a policy to make it harder with more bureaucratic steps to prove you're poor enough for food during the pandemic. I think those were lessons about what we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be increasing barriers and making people prove that they're poor enough for food when we know that the vast majority of people who are coming to food banks are already in the most dire straits and are doing lots of things to try and not go. But when they do, they really need it. For me, the most encouraging parts of COVID were seeing podcasts like this emerge and conversations emerge that really ask, is this time for big, systematic, social structural changes to make sure kids at school have food and that it's universal, that there are policies in place to make sure people have enough money to live. I think those are the lessons that I hope we carry with from the pandemic. I think Ryan is better positioned to talk about what actually worked on the ground to serve people who were able to make it to food banks.
Well, Dave, just to kind of close on the note that you are the forward-looking. That's the whole idea of planning. At what point? And I know you to be an optimistic guy. But at what point do you sense that, okay, this is the channel has been switched here? And I say that because, as I mentioned off the top, ODSP and Ontario Works is finally being recognized by all four major parties in this province as a political priority. Different levels of focus and concern, but it's the first time historically that since I've been following politics in this province where they've all said that needs to be addressed now, and they have a plan to do so. So I'm optimistic in as much as, at least as incremental as it may be, there's a move forward as opposed to rear view mirror. And as Ryan said, they set rates back in the 90s that really haven't changed a whole lot. I took that as a positive. Is there something in the planning question? For example, when you talk about just repurposing school property, is that part of the conversation? Is it part of the vernacular now? Not necessarily among planners even, but at City Hall and government to say, okay, we really need to put a different lens on this.
There are some bright lights out there in terms of good planning. I know that there's a part of Scarborough called the Golden Mile where we had both very enlightened developers plus the United Way plus corporations partnered. And the reason they did is because, first of all, there's a major food store there, but also there's something called a hub, which took care of immigrant women and a lot of immigrant and kind of lower income families as well. So they knew that they had to do planning a bit different. And they've largely done a fairly good job. They, within the built form, and this is not public, this is private, have built in places for community services, for immigrant services, for local farming, and so on. So to me, that is a really good trend. Keep in mind that as each new condo development, and there's tons of them happening right now, but you're talking 5,000 to 10,000 people are moving into basically on top of what used to be a plaza or a used car lot in kind of an intersection. And the services aren't planned for them and need to be. So I think we have a start of rethinking, but we have an awful long way to go to get people who write policy, develop the plans, figure out what's going to happen on the land, to do a better job. So we just have an awful long way to go. So.
Yeah, it just sounds to me like it's a hard conversation to have because the need is so urgent, but the outcomes are years down the road. So it's easy for politically to become distracted or otherwise, not really tuned into what you're talking about. So listen, thanks to all of you for joining us. I expect we're going to have to revisit this discussion at some point. Dave, Jennifer, Ryan, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for listening to the 2030 Project. We would encourage you to subscribe to the show. We're on Apple and Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'd also be grateful if you'd offer a rating on the show. We'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast produced by Eye Contact Productions.